They laughed when he sold his bicycle for pocket change. 4 days later, he pulled up with 5 John Deere tractors. What they didn't know would change everything they thought they knew about success. Before I tell you how a man turned a single 1964 bicycle into 5 brand new tractors in less than a week, I need you to understand something about the 1950s, about faith, about vision, and about what happens when you refuse to let other people's laughter define your destiny. This isn't some fantasy story. This happened. And by the end of this, you'll never look at struggle or at your neighbors the same way again. So hit that subscribe button, because stories like this, they don't get told enough. And drop a comment below telling me, have you ever been mocked for a decision that later proved them all wrong? Let's go back to a time when a handshake meant something, when a man's word was his bond, and when one desperate decision could change the trajectory of an entire family. Picture this. It's the spring of 1957. Eisenhower is president. Elvis is on every radio. And in the small farming community of Millbrook, a dot on the map where everyone knew everyone else's business, a man named Samuel Hutchins was about to do something that would make him either a legend or a fool. The 50s weren't like today. There was no internet to research your decisions, no Google to validate your hunches. You had your gut, your faith, and the community around you. And in Millbrook, the community was everything. Church on Sundays, barn raisings in the summer, gossip that traveled faster than any telephone line. It was a world where a man's reputation could be built over decades and destroyed in an afternoon, where what people thought of you determined whether you'd get credit at the general store or help when your barn caught fire. Sam Hutchins was 42 years old. He had calloused hands from 2 decades of working other men's fields. A wife named Ruth who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself, and 3 children who needed more than he could give them on a sharecropper's wages. Every morning he woke up at 4:30, kissed his sleeping wife on the forehead, and walked 3 miles to the Henderson farm where he worked land that would never be his. Every evening he came home with dirt under his fingernails and dreams he couldn't afford. But Sam had something most men didn't have. He had vision. While other men saw the world as it was, Sam saw the world as it could be. And that vision was about to cost him everything his neighbors thought mattered. He also had a 1954 Schwinn Corvette bicycle, cherry red with chrome fenders that caught the sunlight like mirrors. To everyone else in Millbrook, it was just a bicycle. But to Sam, that bicycle was different. It represented the one time in his life when he'd saved enough money to buy something beautiful, something that wasn't strictly necessary, something that said he was more than just a pair of working hands. He'd bought it 3 years earlier with money he'd saved from doing odd jobs on Sundays, and he'd ridden it to church every week since, his children taking turns, sitting on the handlebars, laughing as the wind whipped through their hair. That bicycle was his dignity on 2 wheels. It was the one possession that separated him from complete poverty in the eyes of his neighbors. And he was about to sell it. On a Tuesday morning in April, Sam rode that bicycle into town one last time. He parked it outside Miller's General Store, the chrome still gleaming despite years of use, and walked inside with a piece of paper he'd written the night before by lamplight. His hands shook slightly as he pinned the note to the community board, right between an advertisement for church social and someone selling laying hens. The note read, "For sale, 1954 Schwinn Corvette bicycle. Best offer. Need cash immediately. S. Hutchins." He stood there for a moment, his hand still on the pushpin, knowing that the moment he walked away, everything would change. He could hear old Mrs. Patterson behind the counter, already leaning forward to read what he'd posted. He could feel the weight of what was coming, the whispers, the judgment, the concerned looks that masked contempt. But he also felt something else, a fierce certainty that burned in his chest like a coal that refused to go out. He was done being poor. He was done working other men's land. And he was willing to sacrifice everything, including his pride, to change his family's future. Within an hour, the whole town knew. By lunchtime, they were laughing. "Poor Sam's so broke he's selling his bicycle," Old Man Tucker said, shaking his head over his coffee at Betty's diner, using that particular tone reserved for discussing failures and fools. Franklin Moore, the bank manager who measured a man's worth in collateral and contracts, chuckled into his Danish and said, "What's he going to do next? Sell his boots?" They thought they were being funny. They thought they understood Sam's situation. Another sharecropper who'd finally hit rock bottom. So desperate, he was liquidating the last remnants of his dignity for grocery money. Even at the post office, Mrs. Henderson whispered to anyone who'd listen, "That Hutchins family, I just don't understand their choices. A man his age should have more sense." The mockery spread through Millbrook like smoke from a barn fire, and Sam felt every word of it. But here's what none of them knew, what they couldn't see because they were too busy judging the surface of a man's life instead of the depth of his vision. Sam Hutchins had a plan. That plan required something they'd all forgotten in their comfort and complacency: the power of a single, decisive action backed by absolute faith. See, 3 months earlier, Sam had heard about the Morrison farm 12 miles east being liquidated. Old Man Morrison had passed away in January, and his children wanted nothing to do with farming. They'd all moved to the city, to factory jobs and office buildings where you worked with your mind instead of your back, where you wore a tie instead of overalls. The estate sale was scheduled for Friday, and everything would go for pennies on the dollar because Morrison's children just wanted it gone. But here's the catch that kept most folks from even considering it. You needed cash. Cold, hard cash. No credit. No I owe us. No promises. And you needed to know what you were looking at. Because to untrained eyes, most of what Morrison owned looked like 30 years of accumulated junk. Sam had walked that property in February, telling Ruth he was just going to pay his respects, look around, remember the old man. But what he was really doing was taking inventory. He'd spent 4 hours in Morrison's barn, running his hands over machinery that everyone else had written off as scrap metal. And there, covered in dust and bird droppings, sitting silent as tombstones, he'd found 5 John Deere Model 60 tractors. They looked rough. Rust on the panels, flat tires, engines that hadn't turned over in years. Most men would have seen junk, but Sam had spent his whole life around machinery, absorbing everything he could because he knew that knowledge was the only currency a poor man could accumulate. He knew those engines. He knew what they could become with the right parts, the right knowledge, the right elbow grease. More importantly, he knew what they were worth if he could get them running. Each one could sell for $300, maybe $350, to the right buyer. And he knew something else, something he'd been carrying in his heart for 13 years. Vincent DeLuca owed him a debt that couldn't be measured in money. By Wednesday afternoon, a traveling salesman named Eddie Kowalski stopped in Millbrook. He saw the bicycle outside the general store with a hand-painted "for sale" sign leaning against it, and his heart lurched with that particular kind of want that beautiful things inspire. Eddie had been on the road for 6 years, sleeping in motor lodges and eating at diners, living out of his Buick, and wondering if he'd ever have a home again. That bicycle represented something he'd lost: the simple pleasure of moving through the world under your own power, without the constant pressure of sales quotas and territory maps. He didn't know Sam, didn't know the story. He just saw a beautiful machine and a man who needed money. "How much?" he asked, and Sam said, $35. His voice steady despite the pain of letting it go. $35. In 1957, that was about 2 weeks' worth of groceries. It was half a month's rent. It wasn't nothing, but it certainly wasn't something. It certainly wasn't 5 tractors. Eddie counted out the bills. Sam shook his hand with a grip that said, "More than words could," and that red Schwinn disappeared down Route 9 in the back of Eddie's Buick. The neighbors saw it happen through diner windows and shop doors. $35, they scoffed, shaking their heads at the tragedy of it all. The man sold his pride for $35. But what they didn't see was Sam walking straight to the telegraph office, his jaw set with determination. That $35 burning a hole in his pocket like a promise, about to be kept. The telegram Sam sent was simple. Just 11 words that carried the weight of 13 years of friendship and a debt forged in blood. Vin, have $35. Need favor. Will explain. Trust me. Sam. He paid for the telegram with money from the bicycle sale, walked home 3 miles in the afternoon heat, and told Ruth what he'd done. She didn't ask questions. She just pulled him close and whispered into his shirt, "I believe in you." That night, Sam couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to his children breathing in the next room, feeling the weight of what he'd set in motion. He'd sold the one thing that made him visible in this town, the one possession that said he was more than just another failed farmer. And he'd done it on the strength of a maybe, a hope, a prayer sent via telegraph to a man he hadn't seen in over a decade. Most people would call that foolishness. Sam called it faith. Now let me stop here and tell you something about desire. Real desire. The kind that changes lives and builds legacies. Not the kind that makes you wish for things while you sit on your couch, scrolling through other people's success stories and wondering why it never happens to you. I'm talking about the kind of desire that wakes you up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat because you can see your children's future slipping away and you refuse. You absolutely refuse to let it happen. The kind of desire that makes you willing to look like a fool in front of everyone you know because you'd rather be mocked for trying than die having never risked anything. Sam Hutchins had that kind of desire. It burned in him like a fever that wouldn't break, a holy discontent with the way things were, and an unshakable belief that God hadn't put him on this earth to die a sharecropper. That desire was what got him out of bed every morning. It was what kept him studying machinery manuals by lamplight when his body screamed for sleep. It was what made him walk Morrison's property in February, seeing value where everyone else saw junk. Thursday morning, Sam was fixing fence posts on the Henderson property when he saw Ruth running across the field toward him, her apron flying behind her, moving faster than he'd seen her move in years. His heart seized. Something was wrong with one of the children. There'd been an accident. The house had caught fire. But when she reached him, breathless and flushed, she thrust a package into his hands. It had arrived, special delivery, postmarked Chicago. Addressed to Samuel Hutchins in handwriting, he recognized immediately. With shaking hands, he opened it. Inside was a worn leather pouch, the kind men carried in the war to keep letters and photographs dry. Inside the pouch was $485 in cash, more money than Sam had ever held at one time in his entire life, and a note written on the back of a receipt. "Sam, I don't know what you're doing, but I know you. Here's what I can spare. Pay me back when you can. If you can't, we're square from Belgium. Vin." Ruth Hutchins held that money in her shaking hands and looked at her husband with tears streaming down her face. And Sam knew they weren't tears of relief about the money. They were tears of recognition, of seeing that faith, real, tangible, impossible faith, had just walked through their door in a leather pouch postmarked from Chicago. See, Vincent DeLuca was a scrap metal dealer now, but in 1944 he'd been private first-class DeLuca, and Sam had pulled him out of a foxhole outside Bastogne when German artillery was turning the forest into hell on earth. Vin had taken shrapnel in his leg, and he would have bled out if Sam hadn't dragged him 300 yards through snow and fire to the medic station. They'd written letters for a few years after the war. Then life had gotten busy, as life does, and the letters had stopped. But some debts don't expire. Some bonds don't weaken with time. And when Sam's telegram arrived at Vin's scrapyard in Chicago, Vin didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He just went to his safe, pulled out every dollar he could spare, and sent it to the man who'd given him a future. Sam kissed his wife, grabbed his hat, and headed toward destiny with $520 in his pocket and a heart full of the kind of faith that moves mountains. The Morrison estate sale started at dawn on Friday, and Sam arrived an hour early while stars still pricked the sky. He wasn't the only one there. There were other farmers, antique dealers, scavengers looking for anything they could resell. But he was the only one who'd done his homework, the only one who knew exactly what he was looking at. The auctioneer was a fast-talking man from the county seat who didn't know tractors from tea kettles and didn't care. He just wanted to move merchandise and get home before dark. When he got to the farm equipment, most folks had already wandered off to look at furniture and tools. Scrap metal, they muttered, waving dismissive hands at machinery they didn't understand. Junk! The first tractor came up, and the auctioneer started at $50, and when nobody bid, he dropped to $40, then $30. Sam's hand went up at $35, and somebody else bid $40, and Sam went $45. And the other man shook his head and walked away. Sold to Samuel Hutchins for $45. No, wait. Sam got it for $87, after two other bidders realized they might be missing something. The second tractor went the same way. Sam bought it for $95. By the third tractor, people were whispering, nudging each other, pointing at the sharecropper, who couldn't afford to keep his bicycle, but somehow had money for broken tractors. "What's Hutchins doing?" they muttered. "Where'd he get that kind of money? He sold his bicycle for $35 2 days ago." The whispers turned to open speculation, then to judgment. Franklin Moore, from the bank, stood with his arms crossed, mentally calculating how much Sam was spending, wondering if he'd stolen it, borrowed it, lost his mind. But Sam kept his hand raised. Third tractor, $102. Fourth tractor, $98. Fifth tractor, $103. When the hammer came down on that last bid, Sam had spent $485. Every penny Vin had sent him, every cent of his faith transformed into metal and potential. He had nothing left. No safety net, no backup plan, no way to feed his family if this went wrong. Just 5 tractors that didn't run, a borrowed flatbed truck from his cousin James, and a vision that everyone else thought was insanity. Saturday and Sunday were when the real work began, the work that separates dreamers from doers, faith from fantasy. Sam and his cousins James and Robert worked in Morrison's old barn by lamplight, their shadows dancing on walls as they pulled engines, swapped parts, cleaned carburetors caked with years of grime and neglect. Sam had spent 3 months planning this, memorizing which tractor had a good carburetor but a bad fuel pump, which one had a seized engine but perfect hydraulics, how he could cannibalize parts from 2 to make one run perfect. His cousins asked him once if he was sure he knew what he was doing, and Sam just kept working, his hands moving with the confidence of a man who'd bet everything on knowledge nobody else thought was valuable. Ruth brought them coffee and sandwiches at midnight, standing in the barn doorway watching her husband work with an intensity she'd never seen before, and she understood that this wasn't about tractors. This was about a man reclaiming his dignity, his future, his right to be more than what circumstance had made him. By Sunday night, 2 of the tractors rumbled to life, their engines coughing black smoke, then settling into a steady rhythm that sounded like victory. By Monday morning at dawn, all 5 were running. Not perfect. They rattled and wheezed, needed more work, needed fine-tuning. But they ran. They moved. They had value. Sam stood in that barn as the sun came up, covered in grease and exhaustion and triumph. And he knew that 4 days ago he'd been a man with a bicycle. And now he was a man with 5 tractors and a future that nobody had given him permission to have. He climbed onto the lead tractor, his cousins mounted the others, and they drove those machines out of Morrison's barn and toward Millbrook, toward the people who'd mocked him, toward a moment that would define the rest of his life. The sound of 5 John Deere engines echoed across the morning fields like thunder, like a resurrection, like faith made manifest in metal and motion. Monday afternoon, Sam drove those 5 tractors into Millbrook's town square one by one, down Main Street past Miller's General Store, where his "For Sale" sign had hung 4 days earlier, past Betty's Diner, where Old Man Tucker spit out his coffee when he saw them coming, past the bank where Franklin Moore stood with his mouth open like a landed fish. Sam parked them in a perfect line in front of the courthouse, hopped off the lead tractor with grease on his hands and grace in his bearing, and walked into the diner like he owned the world. The whole town had stopped. People poured out of shops and offices. Children ran alongside the tractors, whooping and hollering, touching the metal like it was holy. The silence that fell when Sam walked into Betty's Diner was the kind of silence that comes right before everything changes, right before the old order crumbles, and something new is born. "Where'd you get those, Sam?" Old Man Tucker finally managed, his voice smaller than it had been 4 days ago when he'd been mocking a man he thought had hit bottom. Sam smiled, and it wasn't a smug smile, wasn't an "I told you so" smile. It was just the quiet smile of a man who'd bet on himself and won, who'd listened to faith instead of fear, who'd sold his dignity to buy his destiny. "Bought 'em at the Morrison sale," Sam said simply, pouring himself a coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Paid cash." The questions came tumbling out then, everyone wanting to know how. Where'd he get the money? What was he planning? And Sam answered them patiently, telling them about Vincent, about Belgium, about knowledge and faith, and the decision to sacrifice what everyone else thought mattered for what he knew was possible. He told them about the $35 for the bicycle, how that money had bought him a telegram, how the telegram had brought him a friend, how the friend had brought him faith, and how faith had brought him these 5 tractors and a future his children could build on. Within a week, Sam had sold 3 of those tractors to neighboring farms for $350 each. He'd turned a $520 total investment into $1,050. He kept 2 tractors for himself, started his own farming operation on land he leased with option to buy, and within 5 years Samuel Hutchins owned 200 acres, free and clear. But that's not the real story. The real story is what happened to Millbrook, how Sam's gamble taught that town something they'd forgotten in their comfortable certainty and casual cruelty. They learned that mockery is the weapon of people too afraid to try, that faith isn't foolishness when it's backed by knowledge and work and courage, that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns in the moment, but by what he's willing to risk for a better future. Sam never held grudges. He helped Old Man Tucker fix his tractor the next spring. He borrowed money from Franklin Moore's bank years later and paid it back early. He lived his life forward, not looking back at the people who doubted him because he understood something they were only beginning to learn. Everyone's fighting battles you can't see, and the least you can do is not make it harder. Now I want you to sit with this for a moment, because here we are, nearly 70 years later, and we're still doing the same thing those neighbors did, still mocking people for their bold moves, still measuring success by immediate appearances instead of long-term vision, still confusing what we can see with what's actually happening. How many times have you been that neighbor, looking at someone struggle and assuming they're failing instead of planning? How many times have you been Sam Hutchins, holding a dream that everyone else calls crazy, wondering if you should listen to their laughter or your own faith? Sam Hutchins passed away in 1989 at the age of 74, and at his funeral more than 400 people showed up. Farmers whose operations he'd helped start, young men he'd mentored, families he'd quietly helped when times were tough. And in the front row sat Eddie Kowalski, the traveling salesman who'd bought that bicycle 32 years earlier. He'd kept it all those years, maintained it, cherished it, as a reminder of the day he'd unknowingly played a small part in something larger than himself. On the day Sam died, Eddie donated it to the Millbrook Historical Society with a plaque that reads, "The bicycle that changed a town. Never mock a man's sacrifice. You don't know what he's planting." So here's my question for you. The question that matters more than anything else in this story. What's your bicycle? What's the one thing you're holding on to that everyone else sees as valuable, but you know deep in your gut you need to let go of, to make space for something greater? Maybe it's a job that pays well but kills your soul. Maybe it's a relationship that's comfortable but not meant to last. Maybe it's a belief about yourself that you've outgrown but haven't had the courage to shed. Sam Hutchins teaches us that sometimes the most valuable thing you own is the thing you're willing to sacrifice. If this story moved you, don't just hit the like button and move on. Share this. Tag someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me about a time you were mocked for a decision that later proved everyone wrong. Or tell me about a time you were the neighbor and learned your lesson. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this, stories that remind us who we were, so we can remember who we're capable of becoming. And the next time you see someone making a move that doesn't make sense to you, before you mock them, before you judge them, ask yourself this: what if they know something I don't? What if they're planting seeds I can't see yet? What if 4 days from now, they'll be driving their tractors down Main Street while I'm still standing here with my mouth open? Be the person who believes. Be the person who risks. Be the person who sells the bicycle. Because 50 years from now, someone's going to tell your story. Make sure it's worth telling.